ball's in your court.
Thank you, Father Stravinsis. Next time I will be with you on this, but the topic of the hot button issues, I'm very familiar with, not only because of being chair of education, but my experience being president of high school. So some of this you may have heard before, but I went over what are some of the issues that are out there for pastors or chaplains of schools or principals and presidents. And of course, the first one is always the woke issues and the race, the equity, the notion that somehow society's problems can be solved by secular approaches. And before I begin this, I think I always speak when we're addressing the mission of Catholic education or parish life or healthcare or social services, we always begin with that passage from from Mark's gospel, that is found also in Matthew, but Mark's translation I like. Remember, it's Jesus and the rich young man. And in that interaction with the man who asks essentially about eternal life, three things characterize Mark. And I often repeat this, but for those of you, the priests in Catholic education now, it's good to hold on to this. And you can quote this because you may be speaking to an audience of administrators or parents or board members that don't see it, the mission of our schools in this context. The first, of course, is Jesus loves him, we're told. The second is Jesus respects his freedom. And the third, Jesus doesn't compromise. Just a few words on that. When Jesus loved him, of course, when we love people in the context of our faith, we want what's best, which is salvation. And that frames everything we do, why we operate schools, why we have parishes and hospitals and social services. It's for the salvation of souls. Now, it seems to be able to be clearer when we are in our parish life, preaching the sacraments, people coming to Mass. In our schools, it should be very clear because we're leading young people to come to know Christ and to love Christ and to follow Christ. It gets muddy, however, when we move into schools that have been secularized. We see healthcare that can't be distinguished between a private hospital and a Catholic hospital, and certainly in higher education. So the salvation of souls is really what Jesus meant when he said he loved him. The second, of course, is Jesus respects his freedom. Remember, Jesus gives him, follow the commands. I've done that since my youth. Then sell what you have and follow me. That was too much for the rich young man. And so then the rich man leaves, sadly. And Jesus, however, the third aspect is often forgotten. Jesus didn't compromise. Jesus didn't go run after him and tell him, sell half of what you have. No, Jesus remained steadfast in this. And I think all too often in Catholic schools, those three things are forgotten. We forget the salvation of souls. We push the freedom of the individual to either believe or not to believe, but we just leave them at that. And certainly there's too much compromising going on. So on those hot button issues, first the woke. I remember I had a meeting with an administrator from a Catholic private school, and the program that they were having for so-called equity, diversity, and inclusion modeled the public school. And I said, if what you're offering can be found in the public school, you have failed in your approach, and it won't work, because sooner or later, you're not going to be woke enough and they're going to go after you. We base on the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We shouldn't even use those terms. We base it on the dignity of the human person, the sanctity of life, and the dignity of the human person. We're created in God's image and likeness, and we're beloved sons and daughters of God. In that context, there can be no discrimination or prejudice because of race. But too often our schools on these hot button issues panic. A little crude here, but we have at sometimes those in leadership, we might say, at least out west, bedwetters. We have to be firm, always teaching the truth with compassion and charity, but nonetheless the truth. There are not multiple truths. There is the truth. And I think people get very uncomfortable with that. And so this hot button issues, the woke agenda, becomes a way to placate people. I remember back to that school, and I said, it's not going to work. The individual went back to the school, and of course, who's the bishop to tell us what to do? It's not his school. Well, true, although I had to remind them about Catholic identity coming from the bishop based upon the Code of Canon Law, not the provincial. Well, the woke staff, I think, basically went forward on a program. I'm convinced this is a bit of the flavor of the month, but you have damage done in the lives of young people and families. So again, that hot button is the whole woke agenda. And those of you, depending upon where you're from, me having been a priest of the Archdiocese of San Francisco, I'm aware of the challenges that are faced in an urban area. Things are quieter in Eastern Washington as opposed to the western part of the state. You may have heard that Kennedy High School, one of the archdiocesan high schools in the Seattle Archdiocese, at the homecoming elected two girls to be queen of the campus. They admitted having dating each other for the last couple of years. Now that was an archdiocesan school, and that's troublesome. Of course, then we do the gender issue, another hot button issue. And I remember shortly, maybe before I took over as chair, there was an issue of a Catholic school in Maryland where you had an administrator whose child was identifying as a member of another sex, another gender. And it created a huge upheaval in this parish, in this school. And later on, I believe the administrator quit and admitted, I don't know, perhaps as a atheist now. But it just struck me back to that issue of Jesus and compromise. This family did not need to be in this school. And what did they do? They wreaked havoc with not only a school and a parish. And it's very clear to me as a bishop that we are clear on what we stand for as a Catholic school. You do not have to go to us. And it's a choice that's made. But too often, schools have sold their soul for whatever reason. Academic excellence, strong sports program, placating a board. And I used the example like in an interview, I think it was in the fall, about a school, San Domenico, which was the oldest Catholic secondary school in the state of California. It was a school founded by the Dominican Sisters of San Rafael. And I could see in my years teaching, 19 years at Marin Catholic, that school moving more and more away from its Catholic mission, to the point that they formally, probably in the last 5 years, I can't remember exactly, severed the relationship with the church. So it would no longer be in the Kennedy directory as a Catholic school. Well, that wasn't a major unexpected event. Again, the loss of Catholic identity, especially on these hot button issues, I believe come like a slow leak of a tire versus a blowout. You begin to hire people who aren't for the mission. You begin to let certain members serve on the board and they get their way. You have poor administrators. In the end, it's about leadership. And whether it's the leadership of the diocese, the bishop, the superintendent of schools, we know recently, and I'm sure it involved the hot button issue, the Archdiocese of Portland, Archbishop Sample essentially closed down his Catholic school department and is reorganizing that. And a lot of it had to do with a letter on the gender issue. So the whole thing of gender is, as you know, one of those hot button issues. Board membership is crucial. I remember before I became president of Marin Catholic, there had been an administrator who was pushing my predecessor and getting the board that checked all the boxes. The problem with that is you get people on that, and it was, in one sense, so poor that when the school was about to build a brand new chapel, there was opposition by several board members who essentially said, can't you take over the church a block away and make it a chapel? And how often is this chapel going to be used? And there were all these questions. Of course, I spoke, I wasn't president yet, that the school is founded to lead us to Jesus Christ. And in the Catholic faith, as you men know, the Eucharist is center, the source, the summit of our faith. And so a chapel on campus becomes crucial. When the chapel becomes a place where everything but Mass happens, where sacraments aren't taking place, the reconciliation, among others especially, you have a real problem. And board membership can become odd. If you allow a school to seek board members who fit these secular boxes, and I don't want to be disrespectful here, but, have every person in a so-called oppressed group serve as your board membership, where you're going to find yourself right back to a loss of identity. I think there's also a movement, sometimes a hot button issue is there's a mistrust of the hierarchy of the church. So you will have boards being founded that intentionally want to be separate from the life of the church, which would be the office of the bishop. Now, I'm the first to admit that not all members of the hierarchy are with the church in the sense of the proclamation of the gospel and the salvation of souls. I don't think that's going to scandalize any of you. Just read some of the discussions that take place when the bishops gather. But when there's an intentional desire to be completely independent of the church, then I think that issue, that hot button issue, becomes that exactly. It becomes a great challenge for the bishop. And I've had some people say, well, Bishop, we trust you, but what about your successor? Well, I can't, as a bishop, decide why should I work hard on all of these issues when I could be moved tomorrow and someone could come in and change that. So I do think an issue for today is a belief in some segments, probably more traditional conservative crowds, that we don't want to be affiliated with the diocese in any way because the diocese is going to push us out or try to control us or take it away. And honestly, sometimes this is, at least the concern is justified, because you have school departments that are parallel churches. That has been, I have never liked, and I won't put up with parallel churches, whether it is a parallel church run by a religious order, by a social service agency, or healthcare, or even members of religious orders sponsored schools, where they think that somehow the founder or the foundress is the savior. And they quote them, even though the founder and foundress quoted Jesus. So I think you have well-intentioned people, part of the Catholic school community, but they become a source of division. And all these hot button issues are a source of division. The devil divides, distracts, discourages, and if not stopped, destroys. And just think of how good people trying to raise their faith and want a solid Catholic education for the children. And when they can't find it, they get discouraged. And then they want to go and start perhaps something else, rather than, again, helping the schools become thoroughly Catholic. That's another issue. I think another issue, perhaps might be somewhat seemingly complicated, is when a religious order takes its schools and tries to make them juridic persons. And we see this in healthcare, where a religious order of sisters no longer staffs the hospital or sponsors it. Now they create a juridic person that has a few religious left with lay people. And they want to make these schools, and those of you who maybe have a canon law background would know more specifically, but there's a thread of this, that sometimes the juridic person takes out any oversight by the local bishop out of that diocese, though there's schools or institutions operating, and somehow only answers to Rome. And we've seen this. So I think the hot button issues are many, and I haven't even talked about finances, but that's also can be a very difficult thing, where someone comes in and says, look, we have to really water down our Catholic mission because we're not going to draw anybody. Now, we keep in mind, Catholic schools are that. They're a place where young people come that hopefully will grow in grace and wisdom, but they're not seminaries and they're not novitiates. And so not everybody is going to be perhaps where we would hope them to be in their practice of their faith. But as long as they're trying and they seek the Lord with a sincere heart, that's what I hope for, then they have a place in our schools. There shouldn't be the purity test that everybody has to fit a very narrow focus. We hope people, the road is narrow, Jesus has made that clear, but sometimes you have some parents who want only the super Catholics. You want people who support the mission of the school, who benefit from it, are willing to make sacrifices. But again, they're not there where we'd like to be, because none of us are, but we're all striving. And if you want to kind of be encouraged as priests working in education, take the fourth Eucharistic prayer, which is often, as you know, not prayed because you can't separate the preface from the body of the Eucharistic prayer, but read that. It is an account of salvation of history. It's about sin and redemption. And as a great line, all who seek you with a sincere heart and all those whose faith is known to you alone. That's what Catholic schools are about. We're helping young people in the salvation of souls. We're helping them to seek the Lord with a sincere heart. That's kind of my overview on that. I mean, I could give you terrible stories about a troubled America, but I think that's where I like to kind of leave it. And I don't know if I'm able to get questions.
Let's wait. You said you can stay for the whole session, right?
Yes, there's more speakers, is that correct?
No, we'll do the questions at the end of the other.
Yes,
meeting.
okay.
So, Father Belmonte, are you the next up?
One second. Bishop, I'm gonna just stay like this is fine. You're not gonna be on the big screen, but you're gonna be here.
Sure.
It's all right.
Okay. I'm gonna do a fancy PowerPoint. So this image is an image to pray about. This is how we get them. How they come to us. It's a place of theological reflection. We learn about God and we learn about ourselves by praying with and for our students. And there they are suspended between heaven and earth. I'm not suggesting this as an administrator to have students leap off of a stair. It violates certain liability rules that we have, but nevertheless, you get the point of the picture, right? That's how we get them. And which way are they going to go? Are we going to get them to ascend toward heaven or not? Because the powers, the forces that Bishop Daly was talking about are there and are actively trying to drag them down in the other direction. So we have a company in crisis. 1960, this company had approximately 13,000 franchises around the country, a customer base of 5.2 million. By 2000s, the number has fallen out precipitously. The company has 8,600 franchises, 2.6 million customers by 2022. It lost another 2,700 franchises and an additional 34% of its customer base. Think about this. 1960, the company had one of the few privately held companies in its field. Over the last decades, a glut of new privately supported ventures and new public initiatives made that competition much tougher. Excuse me. Prior to 1960, the company was able to pull its best employees from a training center that didn't charge the company for its training. Now the company must employ independent contractors who demand a higher wage and must be trained at company expense. And finally, each franchise must invest heavily in buildings and infrastructure to deliver its product. Unfortunately, many are now surrounded by customers unable to pay retail price because of changing demographics. What company is this? You might think McDonald's, you might think Kohl's department store. This, of course, is the Catholic Church Training Center, the sisters who came to us trained, and now we have independent contractors that have to be trained at our own expense and often are not trained as well. So That's what's going on with our company in crisis, with the franchises that we have. And you can see Lincoln was talking about this very phenomenon. And so here I went to the archives. I was actually able to find a picture from Father Peter's grade school classroom. The 82 students. Not enough kids, right? I think that's actually probably Mother Cabrini in the back there, but in any case, you can see this. You can also see this one, my favorite. See the boy third back from the front, second row in from the left. And he forgot his white shirt for the day. There's always one in every classroom, right? No, that was not me. That was probably my cousin. So, and then we have, of course, our problem with the internet and the mixed messages we're getting. Here's Jesus sitting in the park bench, and he says to the young man, "I'm not talking about Twitter. I literally want you to follow me." Okay. Kids don't change. You can see the smile on her face, beautiful smile. She's having a great time in her Catholic school, which is the whole point. A little picture of technology from previous days. Her sister, very proud of her technological innovation of magnetic mathematics. There it is. And then you have today, the kids too often with their faces glued to the screen, right? So we want to have them understand how to use technology, but sometimes it can simply be too much. Sisters, they're praying around the St. Joseph shrine. And then you have Monsignor in the middle there. Perhaps could look a little happier as we were talking about happy priests, but nevertheless, beautiful day up for First Communion. And then you have a bounteous number of first communicants at this contemporary parish. And then two kids with the May crowning, the boy looking a little less excited than the girl, but nevertheless, right? And so much has changed and so much remains the same. And so here's the challenge in the classroom. In 1940, the teachers identified the greatest threats to the educational process as the following: 1, talking out of turn; 2, chewing gum in class; 3, making noise; 4, getting out of line; 5, improper clothing; and 6, not putting paper in the wastebasket. Imagine the chaos, right? Imagine the confusion in 1940. And then if you switch forward to 2019, a little survey that I found: disruptive behavior. The first one, emotional disconnection and unresponsiveness of students; tantrums and oppositional behavior; defiance, bullying, verbal abuse or threats to teachers, students, or other school personnel; and physical violence towards students, teachers, and other school personnel. So things have remained the same. Smile on that girl's face is the same as it would have been in 1940, but so many things have changed. And so we have these hot button issues, which within this context of Catholic schools are no less difficult. And as I think Bishop Daly said, it's all about leadership. So I offer you this definition of leadership, which I found in this excellent book from Alexander Havard. Leadership is about achieving greatness and holiness by bringing out the greatness and holiness in others. I've read dozens of leadership books. I've been to conferences on leadership. Usually the people who write them and who give the conferences cannot give you a decent definition. Here's a pretty good definition of leadership if you're looking for it. It fits for us as priests, it fits for us as Catholic school leaders. I would even say it fits for bishops. Leadership is about achieving greatness and holiness. I added the holiness part myself, by bringing out the greatness and holiness in others, right? You could even say that that is the goal of a conference such as this: achieving greatness and holiness by bringing out the greatness and holiness in others. So I repeat the Catholic school culture definition from yesterday. A couple of people asked me for it. I can send it to you. Increasing or decreasing your school or diocese's chances of accomplishing its mission by following the basics of what our culture is about. And then you have these 3 friends that we all should be following ourselves and repeating. First friend, Could be George Costanza, maybe not, maybe a little bit better best friend than that, but nevertheless, best friend, develop a hunger for best practices. This is true for ourselves too. Commit to continuous improvement and learning, and then treat everyone, and I mean everyone, with respect. And so these three things should be part of everything that we do, right? And a way of us responding to these hot button issues. And so here are a couple just very practical things. In the Diocese of Joliet, I put together what I called an expectation sheet. You've seen in some dioceses what the dioceses have called oaths of fidelity, where you have teachers who are required to recite the creed and such. Usually that becomes a hot button issue itself with the secular crowd and the secular media reacting to the oath of fidelity. Instead, I proposed, and we used in the Joliet Diocese, this expectation sheet. I won't read through all of it, but it has just the basics of the faith. And then the idea is that you go over it as a Catholic school leader, principal, pastor, or both, and you have the teachers check off each one of those things as you go through those expectations, and then you have them sign at the bottom. It goes into your faculty handbook and is part of their file. So that when we have these instances, and we've talked a little bit about them, for example, a teacher who gets married outside of the church, as we had one teacher in my experience who did that. And when confronted with this by the pastor, said to the pastor, I didn't know that that was a big deal for you people, right? She just said, is that a big deal? And then started a big fight in the faculty. If you have something like this expectation sheet, you can go to number 5 here, and you have the basics of the faith, those 3 bullet points. Life and dignity of every human person, especially the defense of the unborn, the ill, and the aged, as well as the option for the poor and most vulnerable in our society. 2, marriage and family as the foundation of society, especially the biblical view of marriage defined as the union of one man and one woman. Cohabitation, divorce, and remarriage, same-sex marriage, contraception, all erode Christian marriage's meaning as a public, total, lifelong, and fruitful communion of persons between husband and wife. And then 3, the rights and responsibilities, protect the values of religious freedom and the ability to express the Catholic faith in public dialogue. So if you have teachers read this with their school leader, sign off on it, these things that happen after the fact, you can go back and say, what about this statement did you not understand, right? And so you can at least go back to this. Doesn't have to be necessarily part of the contract, but can be part of the handbook. And then you have setting and enforcing Catholic school culture standards for Catholic school employees. Again, I won't read through this whole thing, but basically you address Catholic school culture and the importance of our Catholic teaching from the moment the candidate makes contact with the diocese, right? The job posting, the interview, the offer, the initial employee orientation, current employees, and then if there's a violation of standards, this whole thing addresses how you repeat over and over and over again the importance of Catholic teaching to employees from the moment they contact the diocese to the moment they sign, and then sign again their contract. You just go over and over and over again, so you don't run into this teacher who says, I didn't realize this was a big deal for you. And maybe we even get to the point like Monsignor where they say, well, wow, you people are just too Catholic. I can't work for you, right? Holding difficult conversations. I'll share these documents with you. I had a bad incident, many bad incidents actually in Joliet. Some parents were playing bumper cars in the parking lot with each other at pickup and drop off because they were jockeying for position in line, and one car bumped the other, and then the next day the mother came back and bumped the other car, and so they're playing bumper cars. And so the principal said, can I kick them out? And I said, well, yes, but we need to get a policy on this. So I created this policy of Christian conduct, right? Just the basic expectation, which comes from the gospel, even the Sermon on the Mount, of things that we expect from our parents, so that you can kick them out because they violated this policy, right? It's a very broad policy, but at least you have it on the books. And so you can refer to that and say to the parents themselves, you did not follow our policy, you're out, okay? Then lastly, I believe, sorry. Bullying is another hot topic. You run into it all the time. Parents love to use that as a catch-all for all kinds of behavior. What I found is if you define bullying very clearly, and in state statutes, it's usually defined very clearly, you put that in your handbook, the bullying talk goes away, because when they say, oh, it's bullying, it's usually just bad behavior from children, but and also sometimes from parents. But if you have a good definition for it, you can simply refer to the definition in the handbook and simply say, that's not bullying, that's just simply bad behavior, and the bullying accusations start to disappear. Let's see, I think that's all of them. Oh, yeah, that's it. So a few policies, and so I just, as an administrative geek, just offer to you, these hot button issues are there. What I found is if you have a decent policy, and those policies are enforced by the good people who you hire to enforce them, then usually that's enough to address the problem. I passed out to you a final draft, still in draft form, but of two policies that I presented to the bishop in the Venice Diocese, one on transgenderism and the other one on same-sex attraction with students. Again, to address this. I've also put together an admissions policy just to address the growth in the schools. But admissions policies are also good for things like same-sex couples that present themselves to the school. You have very clear admissions policies. You can apply those to any family or couple that presents themselves to the school, and the admissions policy becomes the reason why they can't be in the school. So just as an example, we had a same-sex couple present themselves to one of our schools this year. The bishop was very concerned about this because possibly explosive. I said, Bishop, not to worry. We're just going to make an admissions meeting, talk about the admissions policy, and they will be at the bottom of the list and will never get in the school. So that's what we did. We had a meeting with the couple. They came in kind of ready to fight and argue. I just made an admissions discussion. And even as the meeting went on, more and more criteria that we have for admissions, they were admitting that they don't meet those criteria, which would be going to church, for example, right? And so they just kind of buried themselves at the meeting too. So it's just about admissions, not about kind of lifestyle choices, but those sorts of policies are also very, very helpful. So if you don't have them, certainly happy to share them with you. If you do have them, make sure that you know what they are, and that if you don't enforce them yourself as a school pastor or parochial vicar, that your school administration is doing that sort of thing, then you get that kind of support from your diocesan Catholic schools office. So that's all I wanted to present.
Okay. Next up is Dave. Yeah.
Father Stravinsky has asked me to present on school issues concerning DEI, and Bishop Daly gave us a nice little summary of the heart of the issues there. So I think what I'll do is just give my take on one little aspect of it and dig in particular to DEI as a curriculum issue. Because if this is an agenda, if you're going to get an agenda pushed through, how are you going to do that? You can do it by taking over the curriculum in some capacity. But first, I think is for us as school leaders or workers in school, we have to be able to present a Catholic vision that counters this. And I think it's important for us, people in this room understand what DEI is, but I think normal people just think DEI is what the letters stand for. Diversity, difference, ooh, that's nice, different ice cream flavors. Equity, they don't understand the difference between equity and equality. They just think of people being treated fairly. And inclusion, everyone wants to be included, right? Nobody wants to be left off the kickball team at recess and so on. So those sound like normal things, in and of themselves, those are harmless things. So I think it's important for us to be able to respond to requests for or having DEI in the curriculum and so on, or racial issues and so on, we have to be able to respond to that level and not get into the level, oh, well, DEI, what it's really trying to do is this. I don't think that helps the cause that we are trying to promote as Catholic school educators. And even if a school is not full on DEI invested, such as mine is, it is dripping in other ways. I fought a battle at my oldest son's school, just last spring against Toni Morrison, reading, I forget why, I subjected myself to reading both books over the summer, Bluest Eye and Beloved. Yes, I forget which one my other son had to read one and the other one at the other one. I actually, where I didn't expect to win the battle at the Jesuit school, I won in asking the teacher not to read one of the Toni Morrison books. And then emailing back and forth, the English department chair was made to be the emissary, if you will, of the religious brother who was running the school and the assistant principal. And I did what book banners need to do, to use the phrase that we did use. I actually read the books. And when I quoted the text and I asked for responses of how on earth are you going to teach this in a Catholic way, I was met with the response of, oh, well, we can't reveal our lesson plans. So the argument from silence is the weakest argument. Anyway, what is the issue here when we're talking about DEI and curriculum? It's usually put under this banner that we need to hear from diverse authors, diverse perspectives. We need to have a more inclusive curriculum. I was asked, as were my colleagues, there's just this past spring, to come up with ways, and that was a term, to come up with a more inclusive curriculum in the language department. And that's just code for having authors of either racial minorities or sexual minorities. That's what that means. So how do we respond to these demands? A couple of points, I would say. First, we would want, as Catholic educators in response, we say our vision is bigger than just anti-racism and diversity. Of course, we're against racism and want it to end. And the way we do that, though, is through teaching transcendental truths about the human person that we know from the scripture, we know from Revelation. I was just for 3 or 4 summers now, COVID was a catalyst. I have a reading group by Zoom with a few students. This year, I have 3 students. This summer, we're reading Ratzinger's newly released The Divine Project. And chapter 3 is on the creation of man. And there's 2 pages in there that could be perfectly used for to use their words, for an anti-racism seminar. That we're all forms, Ratzinger says, we're all formed from the dust of the earth. The same dust, that means we're all of the same creature. There is no difference between us in who we are and how we relate to God. And I stopped and I actually said to the kids, and they were laughing on Zoom. I said, did you ever hear this presented in any of our DEI assemblies? No, is the answer. But I think our response has to be is that we have a better, more compelling vision because it speaks to the heart of what the human person is. That famous line from St. Augustine, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. The Catholic perspective on human nature includes understanding who we are first and foremost as children of God, and only then can arguments of anti-racism and so on stack up and be truly meaningful. So we want to, I would say, our pitch and response would be that we're not looking for a temporally driven curriculum. We want rather something that is universal and transcendental. The old saying, he who marries the zeitgeist is soon to become a widow. If we do that with, oh, we're going to do, what if we outlaw racism tomorrow? What if it all just goes away? Then what good would be an education that was entirely dedicated to anti-racism or to DEI? And believe me, there are plenty of universities out there who's made their new existence into being anti-racist curriculum, which is a stronger form of the DEI curriculum. And then I would add to that, that when we teach, whatever we teach, whether teaching science or math or literature, we're always teaching with one eye toward the eternal, one eye toward God. So what is, for instance, what does a lesson on algebra and solving for X have to do with God? Well, in and of itself, nothing. But in the bigger picture, the language of mathematics is the language of God. God is a creator, a being of reason, and he created a reasonable existence, a reasonable ordered creation through which we can discern our way back to him. So in that way, you just, in a 30-second sidebar, you as a math teacher have just incorporated creation and God into your math lesson, and then you can go back to solving for X just like you would on any other day. Finally, just to close, maybe going about the authors. They've been batted around the internet on certain conservative websites and Catholic websites. It's worthwhile knowing who these books are. We think we had a discussion about this last night, who these authors are, and in particular, the ones for lack of a better term, sexual minorities. Some of those books are really nasty. And we had one successfully removed from the curriculum at Regis when a parent got involved. It was a contemporary book. Other books have become sacrosanct in our curriculum. One to be James Baldwin is one such author, Toni Morrison another, Alice Walker. These are authors who have been around for a while. They have a little bit of tread to them and not contemporary New York Times bestsellers, but nevertheless, we have to be prepared to respond to these claims that just because an author is of a racial minority, Baldwin, Walker, Toni Morrison, that doesn't mean that their books get a free pass. And because all of those books contain pretty graphic sexual content that if I think parents read them and administrators read them, they wouldn't want their students to actually read. So my thing here would be, we have to be able to take kind of meet them at their level and then bring them up to the Catholic level. So we can say, oh, if we want to end racism, what we really need, more prayer, more sacraments, more classes faithful to the magisterium, more grace, more opportunities for confession. Those are the types of things that will end racism and make us a truly inclusive school, because Christ welcomes all, but he welcomes all so that all can be transformed in his name. Thank you.
Just a couple of points. The bishop mentioned about, having standards for admission, but not making the restrictions so restrictive that the Holy Family itself would have problem getting into the school. And sometimes that this is coming from other parents, sometimes of goodwill. A friend of mine has took over a parish school about 15 years ago in a diocese. He had the only habited nun in the diocese was the principal. It was a very, very good school. And when he took over the parish, he started to attract a lot of very so-called traditional Catholic families. They liked his Ars Celebrandi. He was available for confessions and so forth. And the vast majority of these were homeschooling families. And so came time for about a year had passed, and he put the notice in the bulletin, we're taking registrations for next year around March or April. And he went to the principal and he said, "Sister, have any of these families enrolled their children?" He said, "No, not one." And so he called a meeting of these homeschooling parents and he said, "Can you tell me, how you found your first year at St. Mary's?" And, "Oh, Father, you're wonderful. The masses are beautiful. You're available for confessions 25 hours a day," so forth. And he said, "But Sister tells me that none of you have enrolled your children in our school." And all the heads went down like they were in second grade before Sister Clotilda. And he said, "So what's the problem? If the parish is so wonderful, this school is the clearest incarnation of the parish. What's the problem?" And so one woman got up and she said, "Well, I'm only speaking for myself," which of course we knew wasn't true. And she said, "But yes, we know that Sister Veronica is a wonderful sister. We know most of the lay teachers, they're great ladies, they're good teachers. We know that the school is a blue ribbon school. But if Pope John Paul II were the principal of the school, we would not be sending our children to this school." And so he said, "Well, I find this rather puzzling. What's the problem?" And she said, "It's not the faculty, it's not the administration. It's the parents of these other children. We don't want our children contaminated by parents who are not authentically Catholic, who aren't having 12.2 children and all the rest of it. And he said, so is this the consensus of the group? And they said yes. And he said, then I'd ask you to leave the parish because this is not the community of the saved. It's a community of sinners. And so I think we have to be careful. Yes, we want standards, obviously, and we have to forestall problems. But at the same time, there needs to be a challenge to people who think they're holier than thou. And again, as I pointed out to you, if Sister Matthew Joseph had had that mentality in 1955, I would have not gotten into Catholic school precisely because my parents were not married in the church. So yes, to have standards, but to understand. And when she asked for my mother's marriage certificate, and my mother said very feistily, I didn't bother bringing it, you wouldn't accept it. She said, oh, we'll have to work on that, won't we? And by second grade, it was worked on, all right? Thirdly, this whole business about bullying. Why have we raised such a generation of snowflakes? I mean, you know, when I was a kid, you know, two boys would have an argument on the playground. One would call the other guy a dumb Pollock, and he'd say, you're a stupid guinea. And they'd punch each other, they both get detention, and that was the end of the issue, right? Now they have psychotherapy and all the rest of it. And I think it's important for us Catholic educators. Now, we're not talking about real bullying, all right? But as Father John pointed out, a lot of this is just kids stuff, for heaven's sake, all right? And, you know, talk to kids, give them the idea that, you know, I mean, we had that famous saying when I was a kid, you know, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. What's the problem? You know, allow kids to be kids and don't intervene at every second. And certainly don't get the mothers involved, who in turn end up getting lawyers involved and all the rest of it. So, you know, a little thicker skin doesn't hurt anybody. And then, of course, you know, the Pope of the gay agenda, James Martin, has been telling us for decades now that the church has this horrible legacy of persecution of gays. And I've got to tell you, in my years in both grammar school and high school, I never heard anything negative said, but I can tell you this, starting in about 6th or 7th grade, when maybe one or two boys in the class started to act somewhat effeminate, and other boys in the class would start to use negative words toward them. At one point, the teacher would say, Joseph, would you go on an errand, please, and send the kid out of the room? And then say to the rest of the class, I never, ever want to see that kind of behavior again. Every one of us is a child of God. Everyone deserves respect. You're not to use that kind of language against him. And if it happens again, you're going to the pastor and he'll take care of it. Now, if that's persecution, I'd like more of it, all right? And I think we have to address that head on. This is a whole game that's being played, and we're supposed to be made to feel guilty for all of this, for which there is no point in reality for it. So those would just be my last points. And Bishop, are you still with us?
He is. He's still with us.
Okay. Let's see. I'll be happy to take questions, but one of the things I just want to say to especially to the priests that are present here, who might be chaplains or might be eventually a pastor of a parish with a school. I want to be clear. I gave a retreat to the seminarians at St. Patrick's, and my own seminarians for the Diocese of Spokane. We had a gathering on the 4th of July, and they were recalling this seminary retreat I gave to about 50 or 60 seminarians at St. Patrick's in California. And one student got up and said, Bishop, seems to me as you're describing priesthood, I used questions Jesus asked. It's almost as if you're telling us we're running now into a house on fire and our clothes are soaked in gasoline. And I said, that's not the case at all. I'm giving you a realistic picture of the challenges of priesthood. Now, I've been a priest since 1987. I've loved priesthood. I've also been in very difficult assignments. I've been a bishop 8 here in Spokane. In the 19 years I spent at one of the archdiocesan high schools in San Francisco, in the suburbs, Marin Catholic across the Golden Gate Bridge, I was there 19 years. And as I spoke to the Ann Arbor Dominicans, who I invited to the school along with Archbishop Nieder at the time, and they accepted, and they've done a tremendous job there now in their 12th year. They accepted the invitation, Mother Assumpta did, and sent 4 sisters. And then I was made an auxiliary bishop of the Diocese of San Jose for 4 years. But when I met with the superior in her, I guess the end of the first year, she was expecting some of the challenges. And I said, Sister, I'm going to paraphrase the 95th Psalm. I was there 19 years. For 14 years, I endured that generation. In other words, it was very challenging for those. The last, I'd say 3.5 were tremendous, and a 1.5 years were okay. But it's hard work. But and again, with the retreat that I gave to them, and I'm meeting with the seminarians, there's never been the best time for the church, but there have been better times. There've been better times for religious life, for our Catholic schools, but this is the time, as St. John Paul II often spoke about, this is the time that Christ has called us to be in. And I would hope that the priests involved in the ministry of Catholic education have that strength to persevere. Oftentimes, I think we forget that, and it's very much the French school of spirituality, how it's important for us to be humble. Because when we're humble, we know truth. And the great quote of Vincent de Paul about the devil, since the devil does not know how to employ humility, he doesn't know how to combat humility. And humility is an essential starting point for all of us, especially in pastoral roles, either as parish priests, as pastors, as chaplains, or even presidents of schools. To be humble. Humble is not weakness, it's a strength. When we're humble, we're also grateful for our call, for our vocation, for this moment in time, for the people we're called to work with, laity or religious parents. When we're humble and grateful, we're generous. So the priest involved in this ministry has to be generous and can't give up. And sometimes, as I said, my experience of priesthood, the guys that are getting picked off that aren't lasting are guys who get too caught up in the externals. The poorly formed priest of the 70s and part of the 80s, we're all ministers together. It doesn't matter, priesthood's one thing. We're all ministers, those guys fell by the wayside quickly because they did not believe in a vocation as an eternal call. But I've seen priests get into trouble now where they get too caught up in the external and they want things to be easy. It's hard work. And a great image that I keep in mind is if you've ever been in the outskirts of Paris, I think it's a Carmelite seminary. And during the time of the French Revolution, they arrested priests and they kept them in this upper room. And one side of the wall were bars. And the other side was a window looking down to a beautiful, well-landscaped lawn. It's the outskirts of Paris with a little platform. It was a very unique European, that type of brownish gravel there. And they would occasionally go up to the room, bring some of the priests that they had arrested down. Everybody who remained in that room would go to the window and look down, and they would want them to make the oath to the divine constitution. If they did not renounce their faith, they cut their head off, and the head bounced down the thing, and the body dropped. And they would come back and they'd lean the swords against the wall opposite the jail bars. And it soaked the plaster in blood. And it's called the Room of the Swords. And you see this. It's a reminder that things could be worse. And I say it's a very dramatic kind of example of this. But in this moment in time, we're called to make sacrifices. And one of them is to persevere, to know that, that Christ understood frustration. Again, reflect on Matthew, the last chapter, as Jesus is about to ascend to heaven. We often, just read through it quickly. About those men, the first bishops, who lead the church, they worshiped, but they doubted. So they struggled to believe. So I really want to encourage you in the midst of these hot button issues and these other challenges to really persevere and let your heart be with Christ. I was taught by the De La Salle Christian Brothers, and Father Stravinskas would know. I mean, the brothers were known always very loyal to the diocesan clergy because they relied upon the diocesan priests as chaplains. But we began with that prayer as let us remember in the holy presence of God, and we would conclude, live Jesus in our hearts forever. And that's a beautiful saying, live Jesus in our hearts forever. And that's what we have to do. For what is in our heart will give life or death to the soul. So I really encourage you in your prayer life, as you bring the challenges you're going to face. Now, you may be assigned to a parish where it's great. The hard work has been done, and you're just making sure that the good work continues. Then be grateful and be humble and be generous. But if you're part of a group that you might say you could fit into enduring that generation, the high school I taught at was president of, were unionized. Now, I think Philadelphia has unionized schools, maybe New York does. I'm convinced the union negotiations were time off from purgatory for me because they were brutal. And you had people teaching in a Catholic school. Fortunately, they're gone, but there were 4 schools in the system, and it was very difficult. I mean, it was a whole hot button issue. They'll take, a just wage and twist it around. And, we shouldn't be surprised we have these issues, because when Jesus said, let the children come to me and do not hinder them, there's a grace, this when you teach, there's a grace that children have to know Christ. And what better way to defeat that is evil and the devil. So be humble yourself, be prayerful, support one another. I mean, Father Stravinskas, that's why the organization of priests working together, because sometimes you might be the only priest in that school, and it can be difficult. I've had to encourage a young priest who is in the school ministry, and he's in a very good school, but it's still difficult.